Hello, everyone. This is the third recording for Aristotle, a class on the Nicomachean Ethics. We are still talking about Book 1 and about Aristotle's view that there is one final end, eudaimonia, happiness, the well-lived human life. Now, one argument that Aristotle needs to make in Book 1 is that there is precisely one final end, or final value, as we may also put this. Alternatively, someone may argue, well, there is simply no such thing as final value. There is no final end. Or yet someone else might say that there are several final ends or final values. And in particular, that second position is quite widely discussed today in terms of value pluralism. So it is important for us to think through whether we should, be convinced by Aristotle's arguments for the view that really there is only one final value. Now, what is a final value? As a kind of preliminary understanding, and the first thing that Aristotle is sort of saying about this is here's a distinction between ends that are chosen for the sake of something else. Let's say you make it your end to go to the grocery store for the sake of buying spaghetti. So going to the grocery store is an end that you have, but it is not a final end. It is chosen for the sake of something else. So there are ends which are chosen for the sake of something else, but then there are also ends which are chosen for their own sakes. And Aristotle's, as it were, preliminary notion of what is a final end is, well, a final end is an end that is chosen for its own sake. But let's look a little more closely at what he says about the other two options. That either there is just no such thing as final value or a final end, or that there might be several final ends. Against the first of these two options, Aristotle says that, well, then the sequence of ends would go on infinitely. You would always do something or pursue something for the sake of this, for the sake of that, for the sake of that. And it would just go on and on and on and on. And Aristotle says, well, then all of our desire would be empty and in vain. And as it were, life would be desire or to pursue anything at all would be pointless. And it is a really difficult question whether that is true. It is quite widely accepted that in such a chain of ends, there needs to be an endpoint, but it is not undisputed. For current purposes, let's just say we grant that. We grant Aristotle that he has an argument against the view that there is no final value. And this argument sort of works by thinking through a hierarchy of ends and saying, well, there's got to be an endpoint. What about the option that there might be several final values? Suppose someone says, Aristotle thinks that a final value is something that we appeal to in a final answer to why questions. Someone asks you, why are you doing what you're doing? Why are you taking this class, for example? Why are you reading the Nicomachean Ethics? And that initially you would give, as it were, more kind of local replies. You would say, well, I'm doing this because it's a requirement or something. But eventually you would say, well, and I think of this as somehow contributing to leading a good human life. And that means I think of this as contributing to eudaimonia, and that makes eudaimonia your final motivation. But someone might say, well, maybe there are also other final answers, as it were, to those kinds of why questions. Suppose someone says that I'm doing such and such because of beauty, or I'm doing it from duty. And those are my final answers. If someone then asks me, well, why? Then I'm going to say, well, I just told you why. That it is my duty or that this is beautiful. That is the final answer. And there is a real question here of whether Aristotle has anything to say to this. And arguably he does. And a kind of answer to this comes in chapter 7 of Book 1 of the Nicomachean Ethics, where Aristotle develops two criteria or features of what something needs to be like in order to really qualify in his robust sense as a final end. Namely, completeness and self-sufficiency. So those are both disputed and difficult terms, and here's roughly how the argument goes. The thought is that it could be that something is, as it were, sometimes chosen for its own sake. Let's say beauty or duty, or maybe there are other contenders. Maybe those are things that at times we choose for their own sakes. But Aristotle now, as it were, strengthens his account and says, well, happiness is the most end-like end, as we're using a scalar notion of being endish or end-like. Things are more or less ends, and happiness is the most endish or end-like, insofar as it is always chosen for its own sake. And the proposal is that really there is nothing other than happiness that is chosen always for its own sake. And I want to suggest that that is at least an idea worth taking seriously. The second criterion is self-sufficiency. The proposal is, again, that there is really nothing other than happiness or eudaimonia that is self-sufficient in the sense that in itself it makes life desirable and nothing is lacking. The thought is, if you have eudaimonia, if you're happy, then it's not like you're thinking, and in addition, I want X. Rather, happiness or a well-lived human life is as it were already a kind of complex thing with many constituents. But if it is in fact happiness, a well-lived human life, then nothing is lacking. And the proposal is that other contenders for what might seem to us to be final values simply do not meet this criterion that say, you may be doing your duty or you may pursue something because it is beautiful, but then it could still be the case that you also want something else. And the proposal is that happiness is just not like this. Once you have happiness, then nothing is missing. So I will leave it here and invite you to think more about this question of whether on this notion of finality, where what is the final end in the strong sense is something that is always chosen for its own sake, whether on that notion, it is in fact compelling that really there is only going to be one candidate for that role, eudaimonia.